All right, we have Savannah calling in too from the road. Awesome. All right, well, it is 6 o'clock, and so we are going to go ahead and get started with Giant Conversations, finding inspiration in interpreting the parks. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Just as a quick thing, I just wanted to have this one next quick message as we do ask that for those of you who just came in that you make sure you have your microphones muted. Please, everybody, go ahead and keep your cameras off. And throughout the chat, we do encourage, or throughout the conversation, we do encourage you all to be active in the chat. We want to get to know you. We want to invite you to participate in this conversation. So feel free to engage with us in the chat. Feel free to drop in a hello and where you're from. We would love to see where we have everybody calling in from tonight. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And before we get started, we just want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors for this giant conversation. Our sponsor tonight is Pure Brands Communications, and they have an incredible mission to leverage the awesome power of clarity. And they've actually helped us tremendously here in the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, not just by sponsoring Giant Conversations, but they've also helped us to tell our story visually. So we want to say a huge thank you to Pure Brands. I also want to introduce myself. My name is Katie Whiteman. I am the Field Institute Director for the Sequoia Parks Conservancy here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. The Sequoia Parks Conservancy is actually the nonprofit partner to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. Not a lot of people realize that most national parks have a nonprofit partner that helps and supports the National Park Service. Here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, SPC, or the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, is dedicated to supporting a bunch of different programs and supporting all the brave men and women of the National Park Service in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And we do that in a variety of ways. And one of those is by hosting events like this called Giant Conversations. And so we want to thank everybody again for taking time out of your Thursday evenings to join us. Now, tonight we have some really great presenters and panel members that I would like to introduce to everybody. But before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone keeps their videos on, to keep your microphones on chat and also to turn off your cameras. And we do recommend that you change your view to who is talking and as opposed to viewing everybody. So first, I would like to introduce our first panel member, Bill Tweed. Bill Tweed has been associated with Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks for more than 40 years. He's been both as a longtime National Park Service employee and also as an author of a number of books about the parks. And at various times, he has served as the park's chief of interpretation and later as the board president of both organizations that actually came together to form the modern Sequoia Parks Conservancy. So Bill brings decades of experience to our conversation tonight, and we're so excited to have him as part of our panel. We also have John Brantingham, both John and Ann Brantingham. John Brantingham was the first poet laureate of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. He has published 21 books of poetry and fiction, including Crossing the High Sierra, and he's a professor at Mount San Antonio College, where he directs the creative writing program. I've had the honor to work with John and Ann in a number of different ways, and I'm so excited to welcome them to our conversation tonight. And Ann is a nature artist and educator who teaches in Sequoia and Kings Canyon in the summers, and they have really enriched our summer programming in the parks, and I'm so excited to welcome them to tonight. So thank you both for joining. We also have Schulman Smith, who is a songwriter who connected with the Sequoia Parks Conservancy through the release of his 2021 song, Mineral King. He collaborated with SPC last winter in a fundraising campaign for the giant sequoias and brought an awareness to the world stage by performing the song with dancer Daisy Jacobson at the Global Citizen Live event in 2021. And he's been really pivotal in bringing the larger conversation about sequoia conservation to kind of the world stage. So Schulman is here tonight, and Schulman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight and being part of the panel. And lastly, we have Miriam Lagunas, who is a National Park Service ranger and a bilingual park guide stationed here in the foothills in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. She assists in the Foothills Visitor Center with park trip planning, and she also gives interpretive programs to visitors visiting Sequoia and Kings Canyon. So welcome, Miriam. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out of the field and join us virtually in this giant conversation. So welcome again to all of our panel members, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Now, before we get started, we want to just encourage everybody throughout the evening to interact with our panelists. We want you to be active in this conversation. A giant conversation.
Okay.
Conversation is giant by bringing a lot of people together. So we want everybody to join in the conversation through chat. And while our panelists are talking, if you have a question for one of our panelists, we encourage you to put that into the chat. And we ask that you do a little at symbol and direct it to whatever panel member that you would like to ask that question. And we will bring those questions forward at the end when we will open up a time of question and answer time. So feel free to utilize that chat. Now, before we get started tonight, we have a special message from our Executive Director, Savannah Boiano. Savannah Boiano is the Executive Director of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, and she leads our organization. And unfortunately, Savannah couldn't be with us tonight, but we wanted to share her inspiring words with you as an introduction to this very giant conversation. And we're going to bring up a video right now. We're just, yep, here we go. Gary, we don't have volume. If you can make sure to have that volume, please.
Hello and welcome to Giant Conversations. My name is Savannah Boiano, Executive Director of Sequoia Parks Conservancy. Over the last couple of months, Sequoia Parks Conservancy has really been thinking about the role of conversation in affecting positive change for our national parks. And over the coming months, this webinar series will include you in the conversations about some of the most pressing issues facing Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. Established in 1890, Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks are two of the nation's oldest national parks. With 131 years experience managing this landscape, some people think that park staff know it all, can solve it all, and should save everything. And while they are superheroes who go to extraordinary lengths to protect and preserve, they can't do it alone. They rely on all of us to help them. And one of the ways that we can begin our effective stewardship is to learn about the unique issues facing these two parks. Sequoia Parks Conservancy invites you behind the scenes to hear about the issues and to join in the dialogue about the actions and practices to create healthy and more resilient national parks. I think that national parks are where the great American conversation takes place. And over the course of my career, I've talked to thousands of people helping to draw a straight line between their life and what happens in a national park. Sequoia Parks Conservancy wanted to extend the invitation to join the conversation to you. And so thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the series.
The title of tonight's Giant Conversations is Finding Inspiration and Interpreting the Parks. There is a key word in this title that was intentionally chosen, and that word is interpretation. Within the National Park Service, there is a whole group of people dedicated to this one word, and their jobs are solely focused on exploring and incorporating its meaning into their everyday work lives. We are exceptionally lucky to have Bill Tweed here tonight, who was the former Chief of Interpretation in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And we wanted to first engage Bill in introducing this word of interpretation. So we all have kind of a common understanding of what we mean when we say interpretation. So Bill, can you briefly describe what the term interpretation means in the National Park Service?
You're asking a big question, Katie, because it means lots of things to different people. The question takes me back to all those years I was in the park. Takes me back to trying to explain this to two new seasonals coming on duty. What the heck did you just sign up to spend your summer doing? I sat down the other day, gave myself the challenge. So if I had to define it, what would it sound like? And I came up with a perfectly bureaucratic phrase, and I'll read it out, and then we'll bring it to life, okay? I came up with something like this: interpretation, informational services that help visitors and those who care about the parks understand and appreciate the parks and their resources. That's the kind of thing a chief interpreter writes. It's a nice bureaucratic phrase, but let's try to bring some life to it. Because really what we're talking about here is the public human face of the parks. That's what interpretation really is. It goes back a long way. It goes back before the name itself. Sequoia National Park has had an interpretive program since it hired an interpreter full-time in 1928. We're now in the 10th decade of that program. But they weren't interpreters in those days. They were called naturalists. And so we had a park naturalist, later a chief park naturalist. I always liked that title. I liked it better than being a chief of interpretation, to be honest. But that said what the early message was. The early services from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even beyond were classic now outdoor educational things. And those who've gone to the parks a lot will recognize this stuff. It's still in some ways what those of us who've done the work still like the most. It's the fun old-fashioned stuff. It's operating museums and visitor centers. It's providing wayside exhibits. It's free publications like the park newspaper and lots of other things. And traditionally and fundamentally, it used to be almost heavily weighted toward nature walks and campfire programs. That was all aimed really at park visitors, people who came to the park. And that old-time naturalist program, the ancestor of interpretation, did that. It focused almost entirely on people within the parks. But it turned out over time, of course, that wasn't enough, that we had to start to broaden what we were doing. And so the needs of the park changed, the needs of society changed, and of course, the ways we communicate have changed and are still changing every day. You know, a few minutes ago, I was asking you, so how just is it that we're doing this evening? What are all the pieces of this current electronic puzzle? And so interpretation began to replace simple old-fashioned naturalist work. For that reason, and for the fact that a lot of parks in the national park system aren't natural parks anyway. We have historic parks and other sorts, and naturalists didn't necessarily fit very well into historical parks. And so we invented the phrase interpreter, meaning someone who explains or connects. And the Park Service now has stuck with that phrase for almost 70 years. It first appeared in the early 1950s in the service, and it remains the best they've come up with to this date. The newer services now that are being stretched out there include things like social media, a huge and endless changing world, electronic media of all different sorts, school outreach programs. And one that increasingly is connected with interpretation, and I'm glad to say it is connected with interpretation at Sequoia and Kings Canyon, is the public affairs program, which is the part of the Park Service that talks to the news media, to newspapers and to radio and to television, and attempts to spread messages through those various forms of communication. All that, I think, is interpretation. Obviously, when you draw a program this big, you can spend a lot of money. You can always spend more money than you have. I can promise that. I had to face with that many years ago, and still I'm sure my successors do. There are always more opportunities. There are always more challenges. You always have a capacity program. And that has led to one more thing that's been added to the interpretive puzzle over years, and that is originally it was almost entirely something done only by the government, by the Park Service. And today it is also done very much by partners, like tonight with the SPC. The Parks Conservancy has a major interpretive program, and that's Katie's role, as I understand it. She runs the Field Institute, which is very much an interpretive and educational endeavor. Now let's change gears for a second. All this sounds very altruistic, but it's not exactly. Is it doing good things for people? I sure hope so. Is that the reason and the only reason that park managers spend hard-earned tax money on interpretation? No, it's a good reason, but it's not the only reason. There are other fundamental reasons, and these are why these programs have lasted so long and go back to so early in the history of the Park Service. Because in many ways, the fundamental purpose of interpretation is to build public knowledge of the park so that the public will increase its support for the park, so that the public will learn to accept the management programs that go on in the park, and that the public will support, very basically, funding and staffing to keep the parks running. National parks are public institutions. They take place in a democratic system. And if you watch what goes on in our Congress, you know that it's an endless battle of who gets the money and where it goes. And that is as true of the National Park Mission as any other mission that comes before Congress. The reason Stephen Mather, the first director of the Park Service, implemented interpretive programs, then naturalist programs, was to start down the path I just described, to build support for parks by having people know about them and then come to love them. That was true in the 1920s. It is just as true in the 2020s. It is still the role of the Park Service to do that. It's still very much now the role of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy to do that kind of work. And there, in less than my allotted time, I think, is an introduction, I hope, to interpretation. Katie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Bill, for for kind of bringing us to that common understanding. Interpretation is such a huge word in the national parks, and I love that there is an entire division dedicated to it. And not a lot of people realize that there is a whole group of people dedicated to that word and how complex and how big it is. So thank you for bringing us all kind of together under the same platform from which we can launch our conversation from tonight. So thank you so much. What I love about interpretation and even my work as an interpreter with the Field Institute is that as I interact with people from all over the world, I realize that each person that visits a national park experiences it differently and is inspired by different things and sees the national park in a completely different way than I see the national park. And we all capture that inspiration really, really uniquely. We capture that inspiration through a photo, a poem, a song, or maybe we find a kind of a perfect memento in one of our visitor centers that's a sticker or a magnet or a t-shirt to capture maybe our memories of a place if we can't capture that inspiration another way. I'm one of those people that every national park I go to, I have to have a magnet and a sticker because I can't write poetry or draw a picture, but I can capture that inspiration through one of those mementos that takes me back to how I felt when I was visiting those national parks. And tonight, as part of our panel, we have 5 people who have captured and interpreted their inspiration of these amazing parks all differently. And this is where we are in this part of the conversation where we're going to invite our panel members to share their inspiration and how they've interpreted their national park experience. So my 2 questions for each panel member is, where do you find inspiration in the parks and how do you interpret it for others? And John and Ann, I'm actually want to pose that question first to you both. And if you can both kind of talk to us about, where did you find inspiration and how do you interpret that for other people?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've been a writer for a long time, and
I've been drawing forever.
Yeah, and my full-time job is I'm a professor of creative writing at Mount San Antonio College, and most people who come to me to learn how to write aren't thinking about being career writers. What the arts do for you is help with emotional well-being, and what we try to do with it is to end what we call rumination. And rumination is when your thoughts are going swirling around over things that just don't matter, right? It's very easy to get stuck in an internal conversation about things that don't matter when you're stuck in your regular life, right? So I live just outside of Los Angeles, and the number of things I worry about that don't matter, it's constant. And writing allows you to break that rumination and see things for what they actually are. And journeys into nature do that as well, right? You were not worried about the silly email as you're standing on top of more of a rock looking down at Earth. What you see is real now. It matters. And that's the job of writing, really. It's to go into the inside. So I find inspiration in the parks. Where do I find it? I find it both out in the field, anywhere, but also inside myself. Right? It's nice to look up and see a giant sequoia, but it's also nice to look down and see a manzanita berry. And so.
And just to piggyback on what John's saying, when I take people out to draw, we do week-long sessions where people come up to the park to draw and write with us. And what I try to do is use drawing to incorporate the feelings that they're experiencing in the park. So you're drawing something, and I'm going to encourage them to draw something small like the manzanita berry or something like that, and include in it what you're feeling rather than just, you know, like a snapshot of it. And I found that when you have a drawing where you are including the feeling, when you go back and look at it later, months later, all the memories from your trip come back to you. So it's much like the magnet that Katie likes. It's a way of kind of recreating that feeling in yourself again.
And so there are really two ways of writing. Two modes of writing or doing art, and that's for yourself is number one, and for other people is number two. It's impossible to write a poem badly or to make a drawing badly if you're writing or drawing for yourself, right? Because what you're doing is you're going into your subconscious and finding those things that truly matter. What has meaning in this world and what doesn't? What is simply an annoyance that is making me miserable, right? It'd be wonderful if we could see ourselves for what we are. One of the great things about going into Sequoia is it's so big and I'm so small, and that's so beautiful. I'm part of a larger collective universe. It's nice to go in there with just yourself and to go in, but it's also it's great to go in as a community because that's another way to remove ego. I am now part of a larger collective. I'm part of these other people, and I start to work with other people, and I get prompts from other people, and suddenly I'm not so focused on my own problem. I'm focused on what's real. So, and I've given a couple of examples of things we've done to Gary, and this is purely to draw ego away. We start to collaborate on art together. Gary, would you mind bringing up those broadsides? And so Ann starts to draw, and I start to write, and we start writing about what we expect because and drawing about what we expect to be drawing about. But then suddenly we're looking at each other's work, and it changes, right? And the reason it changes is because I'm seeing things through the way that Ann sees things. I'm not a visual person. I have a hard time seeing what's there. And Ann, over the years, has taught me how to see. And I wonder if you could talk about the idea of how, you said several times to me that the visual arts are all about the ability to see.
That's right. It's not the ability to see, it's the ability to look. So what you're doing is you're looking at things, how things are put together, the architecture of how that the leaf from the rose hip meets the branch, how the little edges, the serrated edges really work. you really just look at all the systems and how they go together. And honestly, I know it's a metaphor for how everything in the world is, but to get to jump in and just have your own little thing to draw, it kind of, for me, it becomes very magical, and it's very meditative. And it is a way to look. That snow plant was the most fun thing to draw. It's very intricate, but you just start and you just start going. You don't worry about how the end is going to be. You just start going, and you just allow the process to take care of itself.
Yeah, and so this is a particular kind of poem called a prose poem, and it's basically you've removed line breaks, and the rhyme scheme is different, but it's if you can forget about your past, if you can forget about the fact that in 3rd grade somebody said that you couldn't write or draw, you can lose yourself in this. And suddenly you are inside the meditation of the drawing or the writing. And that's when the rumination ends, right? And it ends also when you look at a snow plant. I don't know if you've ever seen a snow plant, but it takes my breath away every time. You're walking around Long Meadow, and it's a fairly warm day, but there's a little patch of snow and a bright explosion of red. And there's that moment where you just have that almost religious experience where you hear the, right? And that's at that moment, you understand what matters, right? I've gotten, I don't know, 12 emails that have triggered me today, because not because the person who wrote to me was angry or bad or mean or something, but because I have a history as a human being. And I am now dwelling on, without knowing what happened when I was 10 years old, as opposed to looking at what's there. But the snow plant is a real thing. The stuff that I'm ruminating is not a real thing. And so we come up and we start working with writing on that. The idea that we're not trying to be perfect. In fact, perfection is the enemy, right? What we're trying to do is go deep into our own subconscious. I think that covers it. Yeah. Tracy, Katie, I think that's our statement.
Awesome. I was just in the chat talking about how much I love snow plants, and Jonna, and I think something that I've loved over the years is when I've had the chance to interact with you, is just the way that you both bring the parks alive in such a unique way. And Ann, I love that you talked about how the leaves touch the stem and how it comes together, and where that may not be such a small, like it seems like such a small detail, but it's really not. And when we take that time to really look at those small things, those small connections in the park, and then from there try to translate that small connection through a drawing, or John, through your words, how you really, you can see a snow plant and everyone's first question when they see a snow plant is, what is that? They don't understand it. It's this bright pink thing in the middle of the forest, and it literally stops people in their tracks. And I feel like everybody has these visceral emotions when they see this plant. And John, for you to be able to translate that emotion to words, and such beautiful words, it's incredible how the national parks in that way can become eternal. Everybody that sees a snow plant can relate to it in a certain way, and then they can revisit that emotion by Ann seeing your drawing, or John reading your words. It takes them back to that moment. And so that's something I love about both of your work, and the way that you connect people, not just while they're here in the parks, but when they leave the parks and they interact with your work afterwards. The ability for that work to transport them back to this place is just incredible. So thank you both so much for sharing that gift and that inspiration with us.
It's a wonderful thing too, because you get back and you look over what you've written or somebody else has written, or drawn. I was good at writing, and you go back to that place where you understand things are real, what's real and what's false in your life. It's an extraordinary feeling.
Right. And in relation to that, Schulman, you transport people through music, and it's the same question to you is, when talking it with the Mineral King video and the Mineral King song, like, where did you find your inspiration, and And how did you decide how to interpret that through song?
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer the question in reverse,
Absolutely.
because what Ann and John were talking about is really interesting. I do also draw. That was kind of my first form of art, my first form of personal expression, and I know that experience of being in front of something and really looking and trying to describe that to yourself with a pencil or marker or whatever you're using. And the interesting thing with for me, at least, with songwriting is I don't walk through, you know, the forest and hear songs. Like that's not how you know, I write songs about nature and the natural world and what I think of as earth-made creations as opposed to human-made creations. The elements of nature emerge organically for me when I sit down to write. Songwriting for me is something that it's an activity that is sort of like, you know, a separate thing from the rest of my life. And a lot of John was talking about the sort of the thoughts that he has, you know, with other people in his life that sets him off, and that often is what comes out for me when I'm writing as well. But I find that people are not separate from the places that I know them in, and all of the relationships that I have take place within the context of natural spaces. And so when I'm writing about home, or I'm writing about people that I grew up with, I think about the places that we've been together, and a lot of those end up being natural spaces. So for me, nature kind of comes up through my personal relationships, and I don't it's not something that I try to actively do. I don't try to actively, like, you know, write a song about you know, the Mineral King Valley like I would draw a picture of it by standing in front of it. It's not as intentional. And I think that's what's so interesting about inspiration, is that you know, sometimes you can be inspired right there and you make a piece of art, like Ann was describing with drawing. But I find for songwriting, it's a much slower process. These experiences just sort of embed into your mind, and then they later come out when you don't expect them. And that's actually what happened with Mineral King, the song that I wrote about the Mineral King Valley and Sequoia National Park. Is it wasn't actually inspired by my own personal visit of Sequoia and Mineral King. It was inspired by a friend who was visiting my house and was telling me about her visit to Mineral King, and somehow that combination of the relationship that I had with a person, their experience, and the relationship that I had with the place kind of were able to come together and turn into a song completely unexpectedly, without any sort of intention. And I think that is something that people often assume that with art there's a lot of intentionality, and I think that, sort of to get to the first part of the question of where I find inspiration in nature, and in the national parks, there's a contrast that I find between earth-made creation and human-made creation. If I go into a national park and I go for a hike, I often feel rejuvenated. And if I go into a museum, I mean, I love art, so I go to museums and I love it, but after a few hours, I find myself very drained. And there's an experience that I personally have as an artist in a museum and in a human-made art setting, where my ego is activated, and I'm very aware of, wow, this is such an incredible painting, or this is such an incredible work of art. How did a human being think of this? How can I think of this? How can such perfection be preconceived? And then when you walk into a national park, we were just traveling in the White Sands National Park earlier this week in New Mexico, and you get to the top of a dune, and you just see hundreds of other dunes around you, and each individual dune, or in a forest, it's each individual tree. There was no architect of that tree. There was no person who was saying the tree needs to be just like this. And I find that being in those natural environments and being overwhelmed by the scale, it creates a certain freedom within me that my work doesn't have to be perfect. And I am part of the forest of human art, and I am just one little tree in there, and I can be as craggly and messed up as I am, and as long as kind of I stand in the forest with others, it's okay, and that kind of gives me permission to create. And so I find that the national parks and the national forests and the wild lands that we have give that permission to me in a way that a museum just maybe puts me on edge more.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Schulman, thank you so much. I love that you talked about the idea of relationship and relationships in the context of natural spaces, but then how other people's experiences within those natural spaces can really affect us. And I love that part of your journey in writing the Mineral King song was not just your own experience, but someone else's experience contributing to that. And I think that's such a beautiful thing about interpretation, and also the kind of the national park story, is that it's not just a one person story, it's collective stories kind of coming together. And I think Miriam, that's what I love about interpretation as being an interpreter in the National Park Service. It's all about that relationship, and that relationship that we have with our visitors coming in. And the great work as interpreters and naturalists, what we do is kind of what Schulman was alluding to, is bringing those relationships together and creating emotional and intellectual connections for our visitors to a place, and creating our own connections to the visitors, and it becomes this really dynamic relationship. And so as a National Park Service interpreter, where you are living this every day in so many different contexts, I pose those two questions to you, like, where do you find your inspiration in the parks, and how do you interpret that?
Yes, I mean, as an interpreter, I am given the opportunity to connect to so many people, to constantly interact with so many people from all over the world, from the stretch of someone traveling from the other side of the country, or maybe from someone who just lives outside in the gateway communities or in the outskirts of these national parks. And so I'm given that opportunity to really just make that connection with them right off the bat. And, a lot of people come here for various reasons. And I think that that's something that, we sometimes forget. Some people are here to hike. Some people are here to backpack. Some people are here for just a nice scenic drive. And there's just interest, and it ranges from, like I said, hiking to maybe even just going up for a nice drive and smelling the flowers. And so as an interpreter, I find inspiration in a lot of things, which is so hard to pinpoint. But one thing that really stood out to me as you shared that question, as you posed that question, was really the connection that people have to these lands and landscapes. This land was managed for generations before it even became a national park. Before it became a national park, so many people lived here for generations, and they shared knowledge with each other. They passed it down through generations. As we know, there was a use of fire. The Western Monachi, the Yokuts, the Tibat-Tulabal, they all occupied these lands, and they still remain near and close, and they still come to these parks to steward the land, to create educational opportunities, to really give back to the communities as well, and in order for us to continue to protect these lands and make them accessible for all. And I find a lot of inspiration in that human connection with the lands. Maybe for those of you who have visited before, or have been here every year since maybe you were little, if you entered through the southern part of the park, through the foothills, you probably drove through along the river, along the Sequoia River. You probably have maybe stopped by Hospital Rock and have maybe had the opportunity to read some of the interpretive panels there that we had in collaboration with our tribal members, and also come across these bedrock mortars. There's some pictographs there, bedrock mortars, and you know, as the first time that I saw those bedrock mortars, I got a lot of chills. I just was, I had no words really. I remember thinking, wow, so many people lived here, and this is the evidence, really. And while I was lost at words, I had no words. The first time my mother visited that spot, her first instinct was, where are the chiles? We're gonna make some salsa. So that was just her connection with what she saw as part of the park. And I think it's fascinating and inspiring to hear those interpretations from the public. Even though, you know, the use of mortars is in my culture, that's not something that I made that connection to, because we all have different backgrounds. And yeah, so that's something that constantly comes to mind as I am inspired by other visitors. Here in this park as well, and in other national parks like Yosemite, we had Charles Young, which was the first African-American superintendent of the parks here in Sequoia, and Buffalo Soldiers. And they built, they helped build the General's Highway. They help construct trails, some of the same trail systems that we still use today. One of them being the trail that leads to the top of Mount Whitney. They feared and they faced a lot of racial tension. They faced a lot of oppression, racism, and you know, we're talking early 1900s. Some of those same feelings that, you know, a lot of people still face today. And so when a lot of people come to this park and, you know, they read about Charles Young, they read about the Buffalo Soldiers, you know, there's a lot of human connection there as well. A lot of people resonate with those stories, and again, it's an ongoing inspiration for me as I'm able to then connect with these people too and hear about their interpretations to these stories, their connections. I'm constantly learning. I have a little notepad with me and just jotting down information, because it then sparks other interests as well. And then people give me homework as well. You know, they start asking me questions, and I start thinking, wow, I never thought about that. I'm gonna do some homework now so I can dig deeper and continue to share these stories to other people as well. And I mean, that's how do I go about maybe presenting, or the second part of that question, ensuring the interpretation of this inspiration. And I think part of that is just making sure, as I'm an interpreter and I'm able to have these conversations with people, and maybe being the first person to greet them here in these national parks, I want to make sure that I contribute to a positive experience to the parks, to be able to provide as much information as I can to every individual, despite their backgrounds, despite what their experiences are like, despite the language barriers. That's what continues to inspire me, and that's what I continue to strive for.
Miriam, thank you so much. I love, there's so much I can relate to in what you were talking about. And I love the fact that you brought up that idea of human connection, and really the human story behind the national parks, before the national parks were even the national parks, right? That this story didn't start in 1916 when the National Park Service was created, or 1890 when Sequoia and Kings Canyon or Sequoia National Park was established. It started well before that. And I think that people, when they come to the parks, I think people get excited about the trees and, more rock and the bears, and then they're confronted with this very important human story that not a lot were expecting. And I love that you brought that really important, piece of that story forward, and that importance of that human connection. And I love that you brought up the fact that we're always learning, always, as interpreters, always learning. And I have a notebook just like that where I write down all the questions. And after 11 years in the parks, I am still writing down questions and still discovering this place through other people. And I love that about inspiration in the parks, is I continue to be inspired by how other people see the parks and the questions that they bring forward, questions I may have never asked. And I just thank you for your continued work in the visitor centers and your passion to welcome everybody here. It's huge. And a national park wouldn't be the same without people like you who are there to actually physically greet people. And the human story of the parks isn't complete without our National Park Service rangers. So thank you. And I think, transitioning to Bill, Bill is part, I feel like, of that ongoing learning. I mean, Bill is, for everybody here, Bill is kind of a big deal in the parks for all of us interpreters. And we continue our learning always through Bill. And Bill has published so many books about the national parks, and especially specifically here in Sequoia and Kings, and has contributed to everyone's collective learning of this place. And Bill, thank you again for joining us. And as we kind of end with your inspiration and your journey to this place, can you tell us about where you find your inspiration in the parks, and how you have walked your unique journey in interpreting that inspiration for not just visitors, but for park staff and people who are starting their National Park Service career?
Well, let me tear off of what Miriam said and what you just echoed. The joy of this, the personal inspiration, is in learning. That's what captured me so long ago. I first got exposed to the park, and this will sound ancient to everybody, but maybe John. I think I'm still older than John, I'm sure. But it was in the late 1960s, for God's sake. I found a fascinating, beautiful place. I discovered that I loved to learn about it. And I discovered that there was a joy in sharing what I had learned, which is just what Miriam just said, and just what you just said, Katie. And that becomes a feedback loop. Before you ever care about other people, in the end, we do our best to satisfy ourselves. And when we're lucky enough to find something we love to learn about and love to share, and then we get happy people when we share it, what better formula for marching forward decade by decade than that? And so that's what I did. My inspiration started off doing exactly what Miriam is doing. It's wonderful work, being out there with people, talking to them, and meeting their curiosity about this fascinating place we call the park. And that took me into becoming a supervisory naturalist, supervisory ranger. And that took me into restoring the giant forest. And that took me into being a manager, to running the program for a decade. And that took me into nonprofit work. But these are all the same thing. They're all tied together. I just wanted to try it a different way every decade or so. And along the way, I discovered, and maybe Miriam and Katie, you may discover this too. You'll discover that beyond the joy of talking face to face, there are other ways you can communicate. And because of the time I lived in, the education I've had, I started to write. And I started off just writing small park stuff. I went over to the shelf. I got a room here full of Sequoia stuff. That's what you're afraid I've got. But I started off, and pretty soon, 5 minutes, I had a whole pile of stuff that I'd pulled off the shelf. I'd written it. So there's trail guides. There's the General Sherman Tree Guide, a Giant Forest Guide, a Crescent Meadow Road Guide, a Shorty Lovelace Guide, a Highways Guide, a Historic Photos Guide. Yeah, I wrote that stuff for years, mostly when I worked for the park. And that was a way to expand the message, to get to take my inspiration of sharing and take it a little further. And in the years since, then I drifted into, you get more ambitious, or you have more time or something when you get older. And so you start playing with more extended formats. And so I've written a book called The Uncertain Path, which is about the future of national parks. A giant, big, heavy, thick book that everybody refers to as a reference and nobody reads cover to cover, which is the history of the park. And it's a big, fascinating and complex story, and never done. A book about giant sequoia. I love writing this one about giant sequoia trees as members of our culture. That was another way for me to think. It's back to what Miriam said about connecting people with the resource. We've written books about the sequoias as living organisms, as members of the forest, as parts of ecosystems. Well, how about thinking of them as a part of our culture? What is the role of a tree, a particular type of tree in our culture? Something, by the way, I think we've learned a whole lot about again in the last 2 months as the KMP fire burned. And we watched the enormous interest, the symbolism these trees continue to have for people, right? These are far more than just trees. They are symbols for all kinds of values that all kinds of people held. And then actually, thanks to SPC, thank you, SPC, brand new book just arrived here at my home in the last week, a history of the trails, the backcountry trails of the park. There we are. Here's our cue. Roger picked that up. Gary picked that up. And so another way to tell the story of the park, another way to share with a different audience. And I'm working on another thing now. But my inspiration has become to learn and to try to share. And I think in a way, everyone else who's been on this panel spoke in different words to that same thing. Each of us is learning about the park in our own way. I think Schulman and Ann and John, as well as Miriam, all talked about learning, and they're all finding their own ways to express. And in that way, I'm no different. Maybe I'm just even more deeply hooked. So I've been doing this for a very long time, and I'm not done. But that's enough for now.
Thank you so much, Bill. I love that you captured your inspiration with a phrase. I actually wrote it down: a joy in sharing what I learned and expanding the message. And I think that's one of the goals of all of us in interpretation is how do we expand that message? And I think that you've done it in such an eloquent way. And, I think the book Challenge of the Big Trees and King Sequoias lives on all of our bookshelves that we reference all the time when designing our interpretive programs. And not only have you expanded, the message to beyond, to just the interpreters and the people who work in the parks, but beyond the park boundary. And I think that's a question that we're always faced with is how do we expand the park boundaries and invite people, into the story before they come through the entrance gate. And I think, through, John and Ann's work in poetry and drawings, that's a way that we expand those boundaries and we invite people into the story before they even get here. And Schulman, through music is such a beautiful way to connect people to these places and that they can start to envision themselves, becoming part of that process, through that relationship and that context of a natural space and through someone else's experience. And Miriam, when people get to the park and they the first thing they see when they get into a visitor center is someone there to greet them. And I think it's such a vital part for people to feel welcome in the space before they can even start to think about their own national park experience and their own inspiration. They first need to feel welcomed into that space. And I love that you talked about that human connection to this place, and that's kind of where it starts, in where everyone's national park service starts. And then Bill, in talking about that joy and like not just people who work in the national parks or visit them frequently are not it's our joy in sharing isn't just limited to those people, but everybody is welcome to have that same joy in sharing their experience. And how, however they do that, maybe it's talking about that magnet on their fridge that reminds them of a memory, or it's their own drawing of a snow plant, or their photo seeing alpenglow for the first time. And I love that everyone's experience is so different. I want to thank each of you for sharing your inspiration with us. And I can speak from experience that I've personally been touched by everyone's work. And even I actually just met Miriam in person for the first time today and was just so like, I was jazzed by her passion. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I think that's one of the best things about interpretation in the parks is that everybody interprets their inspiration differently, and their interpretations become part of the larger national park story and the larger national park conversation. And I love that the mission of the National Park, in the mission of the National Park Service, it states that the National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park Service for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And I love that in the mission that the National Park Service doesn't just say that we protect the trees and we protect the bears, but for everybody that's here on this conversation, the National Park Service is dedicated to preserving your opportunity to be inspired by these places. That they're not just protecting the place, but that they're protecting your opportunity to be inspired. And it really is an extraordinary mission. And so I invite everybody to maybe answer those two questions for yourselves. What inspires you in the national parks, and how do you interpret that inspiration for others? And I invite you to type that into the chat. And we're, believe it or not, we're almost at the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer, for the panelists to answer some questions that have been posed in the chat. And the first question is to Bill from Laureate. The question is, why do you prefer the term naturalist instead of interpreter?
Hello, Laurie. I think I told you a minute ago, and that title was for me, not for everybody who worked for me necessarily. To me, when I had the job, officially the chief of the Division of Interpretation, I felt my personal challenge was to know as much as I possibly could about everything related to the park. I didn't want to just be a manager. I wanted to be a source. I wanted to know things. And to me, if I was to be a source of knowledge, being a naturalist was a lot better way to share my mission with the public than just being an interpreter. So in a way, it was a personal challenge for myself to see if I could continue to aspire to that level of performance. Could I truly be a naturalist? Could I have that level of knowledge?
And another question to Bill from Robert. Bill asks, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how the KMP complex fire will change the parks we love. Any change? Do you think there'll be any change in visitor experience or any change in policy going forward?
Well, I think, Katie, we have another hour or two.
Right?
That's a huge, huge question. It has 1,000 implications, most of which are just beginning to come into focus. I'll tell you what jumps out to me in a minute or so. I'll try to be brief. I think it brings us starkly to the face of what you just said, Katie, that we're here to preserve unimpaired. I wrote a book about that. That's the Uncertain Path book, about what is it really possible to freeze time in national parks and have nothing ever change? I was playing with that subject in print a decade ago, 12 dozen years ago now. The question has just become ever more powerful. And the answer is, of course, we cannot stop change. We're going to have to decide what we're going to manage, decide how to save it. The fact that we can leave it, I'm talking sort of policy now, the fact that we think we can leave it all alone and it will stay the same, we now know is simply not true. The world is changing too fast. That provides or presents huge questions to the National Park mission. And to people like Miriam, it provides huge challenges of how to explain the park. So what just happened here? And what does it really mean? And how do we tie that wonderful mission that the Park Service has sold now for well over a century to a very difficult era in which we now live and things are changing so fast? And we could go on, but that's the 1 minute answer instead of the 1 hour answer to that very good question.
That's a great question. I agree. Thank you, Robert, for asking that great question. And the last question that we'll end with before we conclude everything is to Miriam from Laureate. And she has a question. Did you grow up visiting national parks? And she's interested in how you chose interpretation as a career.
So growing up, I did not visit national parks. I didn't even know they existed, to be honest. I wasn't aware that, the Channel Islands was my backyard until I was maybe in my early 20s. And that's when I was introduced to that career, really, from just being on a guided tour from a park ranger there. And I thought, that would be a really sweet gig to have. And then, I chose interpretation. It was an opportunity that I said I've never really done before. And so I'm going to go ahead and give it a try. And I tried it, and I've been here since for about a year now. And I'm constantly learning. Like I said, I can't emphasize learning never stops. And it's just part of having fun out here. And it just keeps getting better and better.
Thank you, Miriam. I had the same experience. My first season, I was like, well, I'm just going to do this job for 1 summer. I'm going to go spend 1 summer in the national parks doing some interpretation. And that was 11 years ago. And I am still here. So these places have a way of keeping us sucked in. And so before we conclude this amazing conversation, I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and being an active part of this conversation. We are going to wrap up here in just a minute, but if anybody has other questions, we're going to stay on for another couple minutes after we conclude, and the panel members will stay on for a couple more minutes to answer any last minute questions that people might have. But before we include this conversation about finding inspiration in interpreting the parks, we would like to extend another invitation to everybody here tonight. And first, what I would like everybody to do is, I want you to all think about your favorite national park moment, whether it was the Sequoia and Kings Canyon, or maybe the Great Sand Dunes, or Channel Islands, or the Grand Canyon. I want you to think about your favorite national park moment. I want you to try to remember every detail of that moment, what colors you saw, what did you see, other things did you see, what did you feel, what did you smell? Try to remember that moment. Now, I want you to try and imagine that experience never happening, and taking that experience away from your life. And I want to ask you about how you think your life would be different if that National Park Service moment was taken away. Here in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, we have a really robust educational program which reaches more than 23,000 students from the grades of kindergarten through 12th grade in the counties of Fresno, Kings, and Tulare. And we do that every year. And we humbly ask everybody tonight to consider donating to our education and outreach program to help provide opportunities for our local school children to start their own National Park Service stories, so they can become part of this giant conversation of inspiration, and they can start interpreting the national parks on their own. Donations tonight will enable more schools to use Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks as their outdoor classrooms on ranger-led field trips, and also enable summer internships and other service learning programs that support outdoor learning in schools. And to help us to continue to fund opportunities for our local school children so they can find their own inspiration. And we have a link in our chat to our support a program page on our Sequoia Parks Conservancy website, where you'll see an opportunity to donate to the education and outreach program. You can see it on the screen there, as well as all the other programs that we support in the parks. And we also, before everybody leaves, we want to say a big thank you to everyone who has donated to the KMP Complex Fund so far, and all these other programs. We are blown away by everyone's support of our organization and of these parks, and we just want to say thank you all so much for for your previous donations and also for joining us tonight. And on that note, that concludes our very first Giant Conversations. And we want to say thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. And if you all are free next month, we do have another Giant Conversation on Thursday, December 16th, where we will have a fireside chat with the superintendent of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, Clay Jordan, and also our very own Savannah Boyano, our executive director for the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, where they're going to be discussing top issues that are facing our parks. And you can register for that event in our chat as well. So, and we've got another question for our panelists too, if anybody wants to hang around from a panel member. So again, we'll be here for a little bit to answer any last minute questions that anybody might have if people want to hang around. So, and thank you all again for joining us. Another question that we had, and Bill, this was a question for you as people are kind of still sticking around, is in your view, what was the difference between the mission between the National Park and the National Forest Service?
Yeah, I saw that question from Lynn. Hello, Lynn. Traditionally, the missions were quite separate and different. National parks, and Katie said this a few minutes ago, were set aside to preserve things as intact as possible and to allow for their enjoyment while maintaining their quality. That's a paraphrase of the National Park mission. National forests were set aside to make intelligent use of the land. It could be mined, it could be you could have hunting, you could have logging, but in a way that was meant to be sustainable for the benefit of society. Both agencies go back over a century now with those two missions. Locally, this has gotten much more complicated when the national monument was put on top of the national forest. And the national monument has a preservation mission that is set up on the top of a national forest management program meant for use. And if that sounds confusing, I think the management of that land for the last 20 years reflects that confusion and controversy, because it is complicated and it's a model that's still sort of being wrestled with what it actually means. So short answer, two clean missions that have gotten confused in Tulare County.
Awesome, thank you, Bill. Now we've still got about 41 people in the chat. And does anybody else have any questions before we end our conversation tonight? I'm gonna open it up just for a little bit. Lots of thank yous in the chat. Well, as we kind of wait for any last minute questions, I just want to say thank you so much again to each of you. What an amazing, I am so pumped to go out and start my inspiration journey. So thank you all so much for taking the time tonight to talk about this really important topic that isn't really discussed all that much. And so thank you so much for helping us launch our very first Giant Conversation. And I don't think that we have any more questions, so we'll go ahead and end the chat. But thank you so much to each of you. I can't begin to thank you enough. Thank you so much for taking the time. And do any of you have any last minute questions or last thoughts that you want to share?
Just thanks to you folks for organizing it.
I'd like to congratulate you on your abilities and your effort in making this a well-coordinated effort. And I would like to ask Bill, one little question is, can you give us a sketch of your Trails book and exactly why you did this?
The Trails book, Granite Pathways, brand new. I've been hiking the trails of the parks since I really got to know the park as a backcountry hiker in my teen years in the 1960s. I got fascinated. When I was 17 years old, my dad dropped me a Whitney Portal and I walked to Mineral King with a $6 pack. I lived. Broke every rule in the modern book. We didn't have any rules then, but I loved it. And so I began a program that I eventually hiked all the trails of the parks. It took decades. I went to lots of places off trail. But because of the fact that I'm also by nature a historian and a collector of stories, I wanted to know where the trails came from. Why are they there? Why this canyon has a trail and that one doesn't? Why is one trail good and one bad? Why is one trail maintained and one only on old maps and long abandoned and you can't find it? And so I began to look for their individual stories. And what the historical mind leads you to is if you see the pieces, then you want to try to add it up into a narrative. And so I found myself turning individual stories, seeking to find a way to turn individual stories into a historical narrative that starts with Native Americans and sheep herders and ended up with leading on through the Sierra Club and the early agencies and the Civilian Conservation Corps and even things like the National Trails Act of the 1960s and 70s, and trying to see it as a narrative that told us something about not only ourselves, but about what we think about this wilderness that we try to protect. And so, without giving away all the stories, that's the inspiration of the book. 70,000 words, and I will say, compared to writing poetry, I learned something when I had to work with teams that wrote exhibitry. Wayside exhibits, you have to be short. It is so much harder to write short than it is to write long. So when in doubt, you just write a book. It's much easier, really. You can just keep going. I don't know if that's true of music, but it's very true of words. When you only get 100 words, they really have to count. If you have 70,000 words to work with, you got a little more leeway.
Oh man, absolutely. I wish I had 70,000 words on programs. Oh, that'd be great. All right. Well, we got looks like someone popped in. Looks like Adam popped in Schulman's Spotify playlist. The playlist on Spotify. Schulman, you got a fan out there? That's awesome. All right, well, everybody, we're going to go ahead and release our panel members to the rest of their evenings. And I just want to say thank you again for, the gosh, it's 26 of you that have stuck around to continue to interact and listen. Thank you all so much. And we'll let everybody go and enjoy the rest of their evenings. And we hope to see you all back in the parks very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
This conference will now be recorded.